Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Howarth, and we're going to be talking about JavaScript Basics. So starting out with our table of contents, we'll talk about what JavaScript is, why we should use it, where to use it, how to use it, and then finally, further resources for learning JavaScript. So starting out, JavaScript is a scripting language. All scripting languages are also programming languages. The difference between the two is that scripts from a scripting language are interpreted rather than compiled. And what this really is an interpreted, or when scripting is interpreted, that means it is read line by line and interpreted into machine code, rather than being compiled, where the whole program is read and analyzed, and then it's turned into machine code. And machine code is what computers are able to understand, and then they can perform upon the code. So the difference is that JavaScript doesn't have to go through the extra compilation step. It is one of the most popular languages, and JavaScript is used to create interactive web elements such as buttons, autocomplete, and the hamburger menu. So, for example, the hamburger menu is the 3 horizontal lines that appear, and when you click on it, it will reveal more of the menu options. And as an example, if we go to the DoSpace website, we can see that they have a menu at the top, but when the window becomes more narrow, it condenses and instead turns into a hamburger button. And this is possible because of JavaScript. Next, we have why to use JavaScript. JavaScript runs on nearly every browser. It runs on all the major browsers, and it is used to create web applications and also game development. So some examples of game development in JavaScript are, if I pull it up, here's a website called codepen.io. It holds code such as HTML, CSS, JavaScript that you can put together and then see the outcome of it. And in this case, we have a simple snake game. So the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. This is all the JavaScript used to make this game. And in the bottom, we can play it if we wanted to. Additionally, we also have another snake game, also HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The game part works because of JavaScript. And lastly, another game made with JavaScript. Game over. So each of those games was developed using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Along with front-end development, JavaScript can also be used for the backend. It's a very versatile language. You can do backend, front-end, and also do database interactions. So JavaScript can be used for backend code. Node.js is a JavaScript platform that has APIs to support that server-side development, and server-side is the backend. So a web application has the front end, which is the part that users or customers interact with. The front end client will send requests to the backend, and the backend will manage those requests and produce a response to give back to the front end. So the backend server is what handles the data from the client and will interact with the database to retrieve or store data as needed. So for example, you've probably seen a 404 HTTP response code. 404 means that it wasn't able to find the requested URL. So if you go to a page on a website that doesn't exist, it might say 404. That's the response of you trying to access that page. Another common response is 200, which means that everything went okay. And also you maybe have seen the 500 response. That means that there was some internal server error and the request sent by the client or by the front end could not have been handled by the server for some reason. JavaScript is also able to run queries on SQL database. So also, why should we use JavaScript? So it makes web applications interactive. And for example, user forms are a very common component on websites. So some examples of forms are register an account, create an account. Also, log into your account if you're already a user, or if you're filling out payment information, here's a payment form. So, type in your name, whatever other information is necessary. And this, what you see on the slide here is from the DoSpace website. If you want to join DoSpace as a member, you will fill out this form. And JavaScript allows you to receive feedback while filling out the form, and it can let the user know if the data they have inputted is valid or not. So for example, sometimes passwords will have some security rules that specify a minimum length for the password, or may specify the types of characters or which characters you must include at least one of in the password. And these requirements can be enforced using JavaScript. Also, here you can see that they are required fields. So there's the word required next to those fields. This would be enforced on the front end using JavaScript. Another feature of websites, or specifically social media, it's all over social media sites, is that continuous scrolling. It just seems like you're scrolling forever and ever and ever. And it's because when you reach the end, JavaScript will trigger a new request out to the server to retrieve more data, or if you're on Facebook, for example, more Facebook posts, and it'll load, and you can just keep on going. So next, where can we use JavaScript? Well, if you want to do little quick tests with JavaScript, you can use the console in your browser's DevTools. So for example, if I have Chrome pulled up here, and I can open the browser DevTools on Chrome using F12 or Control-Shift-I, or by going to the three dots at the top, hitting More Tools, and then going to Developer Tools. And once I have Developer Tools open, there should be some options at the top: Elements, Console, Sources, and Console is where we would do our development. So if you are in the right spot, you should see a little blue arrow with a cursor flashing. And in here, we are ready to type some JavaScript. So for example, we can type 3 plus 3. And if we press enter, we see that it tells us 6. It gives us 6 as a response. We'll go more into JavaScript, actually typing it later. But continuing from where to use JavaScript, if you want to use it online, so use some remote code editor on the internet, some good examples are JS Fiddle. So if we go to JS Fiddle, pull it up. JS Fiddle supports collaboration, and it includes 4 different windows or panes, whichever word you like to use, for HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then the bottom right is the result of all this code put together. So for example, if we put up here h1 id equals hi, and maybe type hi inside of here, if we run it, we see that we have hi in our result pane. Now, if we add some JavaScript, we can say, okay, the document, so that HTML page, we're going to get an element by ID, and the ID we have up there is called hi, and we're going to set that inner HTML to by. So now if I run it, the JavaScript has changed the inner HTML of our element. The next one is JSBin, and JSBin is very similar to JS Fiddle. you have different panes. So in this example, we have the HTML in the output, but at the top, now at the top, if we click, we can see some more open up. And they're all vertical next to each other. You can also open a console, but we can just stick to here. So in this case, we could do something very similar, create the h1 ID equals hi, hi, close the h1, and then set the JavaScript to bye. If you ever had issues copying comma or those quotes over, for some reason they are different types of quotes and they don't quite work, but so you have to retype it in so it's the correct kind of quote. But now it says bye. And the next one is CodePen, and we actually saw CodePen with those game examples. It has the 3 at the top, and then the bottom is the result. So HTML, CSS, JS, and you can at the bottom see the result. You don't need to sign in, it's very similar. All of these 3 are meant for testing out JavaScript. They're known as JavaScript playgrounds, so you can just make some small little programs, test out your JavaScript. And the last one is Glitch. So glitch.com. It's similar to the others, except it has a bit more features. So if we go to glitch.com, you'll need to sign in, I believe. So let me sign in real quick. But glitch.com allows you to have a URL. So if you want to create something like what was created before, like games, for example, you can create it and then have a URL that you can share with friends, family, whoever you want to show it to. And you can also have other people edit it, or they can create remixes from your code. So if you don't want anyone to make changes to your stuff, but you want them to be able to work from it, then you can have remixes of the code. So I'm entering the dual factor authentication right now. Numlock is off. Let me try that again. So glitch.com, you can create projects. If you've taken Hello Code with through DoSpace, then you are probably familiar with Glitch and have experience with changing or setting the URL. So it's loading right now, but what would show is the main code editing area and then your files on the side. So you can have your HTML files, your CSS file. So if I zoom in a little bit here, we have an HTML file, JavaScript file, and a CSS file. So you can make all your changes, and then you can see your changes with the show button. So like in a new window, for example, and up at the top is the URL for this website you've made. The first part of that URL is from the project name that you're able to edit. So you don't have to use these randomly generated words. But glitch.com is very useful for making things that you can show to other people and collaborate with other people. If you want to develop on your own computer, so not rely on something on the code editors online, then you can use some IDEs for IDEs on your PC. So for example, later I'll be using Visual Studio Code, and this is the one I recommend for. I do most of my development with Visual Studio Code. It's simple, but it also allows you to add any like functionality that you need. So if you are coding in a new language and maybe you want to if you want color coordination between different elements of your program, then you can install the correct thing to add. with Visual Studio Code. Online suggests WebStorm and Atom. I don't really have experience using these with JavaScript, but they're very popular online solutions for software or IDEs that you install on your computer. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment. It's a software that you put on your computer for developing applications, and it has a code editor. So that's what an IDE is. And if you don't have any software downloaded on your computer, then you can use the text editor that comes with your computer. So for example, on Windows PCs, Notepad is available. So if you just want to do very, very simple, no IDEs required development, then you can use Notepad. So next, JavaScript can be, so this is adding JavaScript to your HTML. So assuming you've got your HTML base ready and you want to make it interactive, where do you put the JavaScript? So there are two ways to do this. You can have inline JavaScript, which is when you create the script tag and then put the actual code between those script tags. And you can have external JavaScript, where you, instead of putting that JavaScript code in the HTML file, you remove it, put it in a separate JavaScript file, and then you'll have to create some way that they can view each other. So you do that with the script tag, except as an attribute inside of the opening script tag, you create the source attribute and set it equal to that JavaScript file. It's good practice to have external JavaScript rather than inline, because you are able to reuse and maintain separate JavaScript files easier than if you had to maintain a bunch of inline JavaScript across all of your web pages on your website. So let me show an example of this. So for example, with inline JavaScript, let me pull this over. With inline JavaScript, the code goes between the opening and closing script tags. So what I just highlighted, this is the actual JavaScript. It's between opening and closing script tags, and if we run our code, we can see that it creates this hi button, and if we click it, this is inline JavaScript. It's in the same file as HTML. So my body had the hi button, and when we clicked it, it called the JavaScript function called alert me. So an alert me created that pop-up. And next we have the external JavaScript, which is when you have the exterior, the separate JavaScript file. So for example, with external, here's the same HTML with the button. It's called hi, that calls alert me when you click. However, there's no code between this opening and closing script tag. Instead, there's an attribute that points to the source of the JavaScript that we are importing, and it's called external JavaScript. So if you look at our external JavaScript, we see that function called alert me, and it looks like it's going to say something called external JavaScript. So if we run our HTML, we see the hi button. Remember, this is the external one. And it says external JavaScript. It's in a separate file from the HTML. So HTML reads top to bottom. These script tags can go in either the head or the body elements of HTML. And it doesn't always matter where you put them, but sometimes it does, because if HTML reads top to bottom, then it's going to be reading, and then it's going to see this script that you've put into your HTML. And if there's important HTML below it, then since your HTML has is currently at that script, it's going to have to load all of that script, which might postpone the loading of the actual HTML content. So if you have large JavaScript files that are going to take a while to load, then it might not be a good idea to put them at the top, because then your actual content won't load since your browser is busy loading in that JavaScript. So instead, you could put it beneath your HTML, so all the actual content of your web page loads, and then it worries about the script, the loading of the JavaScript. So next, how do we use JavaScript? So remember, JavaScript is a programming language, and it's an object-oriented programming language. It uses very similar coding concepts to a bunch of other languages like Java and Python. And I should clarify, JavaScript and Java are two different languages. Java is, I kind of think of it as more of a back-end language. JavaScript is more of the front-end language, even though it can be used, all across the different sides of a web application. So starting out, variables are things that hold data. There are different types of data that variables can hold, including numbers and strings. So strings it's text. It's either one character or a bunch of characters stringed together. Also, variables can be objects, and there are more. So variables can be created using the var keyword. So that first option, var, it's kind of it's a little older, but it's still used. It's more of making a general variable. Let is used when it's another way to create a variable, but the let keyword word is used when you are creating a variable that's going to be used in just a specific region. It's not going to be used, throughout your whole program. It's just in a small block of code, and it might change a little bit, like the value inside that variable might change. The next one is const. For constant, the value of a variable that is const does not change. It's not meant to change. So if we look at the console, so we're going back to the console now, I'm going to open it with the triple dots, more tools, and developer tools. So now we have the console open. And in here, remember we did 3 plus 3 earlier? It equals 6. In here, we can create a variable. So you can see some examples of what I've done previously, but var, and I'll do name equals. So what's going on here is we are creating a variable, and you can tell because of the var keyword that is used, and then a space separator followed by name. So name is the actual name we're giving the variable. This does not have to be name at all. We could call this my name, or sorry, no, my name. It's like if you're holding a basket and you want to, put a label on that basket, I'm putting the label my name. And we're going to set it equal to, I'm going to set it equal to Morgan. If you are following along, you can set it along to whatever your name is. But the value you set here should be surrounded by quotes, because name is going to be a string. Remember, string are characters, they're letters, numbers, any combination of those. And to denote that it's a string, we have to surround it with quotes. So I'm going to say Morgan. And JavaScript ends its lines with semicolons, but it's pretty forgiving, so it will usually understand what you're typing. So var, my name equals Morgan. Okay, cool. Now this console has a variable called my name that's set to Morgan, and we can check that. We can actually have it alert. What alert is it is a function that will create a pop-up. So we saw this pop-up earlier when we were clicking that hi button, and it was like inline JavaScript. This JavaScript is inside of the HTML file. That was an example of an alert. And alert with a function, it has parentheses, and you can put things in those parentheses depending on what the definition of the function is. But with alert, whatever you put inside that parentheses is what is put inside that message of the pop-up. So in this case, we want it to pop up the name we inputted earlier. So we're going to pass it the variable that's holding whatever name was put in. And we will run it. So now we had a pop-up that had the name that we put up here. And next we have conditionals. Conditionals are if it's not this, else that, and they determine if certain pieces of code should run or not run. Conditionals need a condition, and it evaluates those conditions to true or false, and whether it's true, if it's true, it will run that block of code. If it's false, it will move on to whatever is next. So for example, if we bring back that console, here we can make an if statement. If the my name we had defined up there, if we get its length, so dot length is returning the number of characters of that string, and so Morgan has 6 characters. So if my name dot length is greater than 3, then let's console.log. So console.log means just output it right underneath. So like put the answer right underneath. So console.log name is longer than 3 characters. Now if we run this, it just outputted name is longer than 3 characters. And if we update my name, so we change my name and let's set it to something new. Maybe my name is AJ. Okay, cool. Now the variable has the value AJ. And if we rerun above, then nothing outputs. There's nothing to output because this conditional evaluated to false. So it's not going to run anything. Ifs, you can also use an else. So an else means if the condition above it did not evaluate to true, then this will be what it defaults to. So else will console.log that name is 3 characters long or shorter. So now that we run this piece of code, it goes back to that else and says that the name is 3 characters long or shorter. 3 characters short. Yeah. Also, I want to talk about the double equals and triple equals that JavaScript uses. So we've seen single equal sign. So if you zoom in, see the single equal sign. The purpose of this is for assignment. We are assigning this variable the value AJ. The double equals is used for comparison. So we can check to see is hello equal to, so this is asking a question, is it equal? True. Now we can ask, is 5, the number 5, and it's a number because there's no quotes surrounding it, is the number 5 equal to the string 5? And in JavaScript, this evaluates to true, even though this is a string and this is the number. So true. But the triple equal signs determines that they are both equal and the same data type. So now this one evaluates to false because they are not the same data type. One is a number, one is a string. So next we have loops. Loops run the same code over and over. So if you have a list of data that you want to do something with, so like a list of 3 elements, and you want to do something to each of those elements, you're going to have to run the same code over again, in this case, 3 times. So if we follow along with another example through the console, let's say we have var animals. So we're going to create a variable called animals, and we're going to store a list in this variable. So a list is a collection of different pieces of data. In this case, we're going to have 4 different types of animals. So we'll have horses, we'll have horses, and fish, and geckos, and let's see, what's another animal? Maybe cats. So now we have a variable called animals. And if we want to, let's say we want to loop through all those animals and we want to change the strings to, instead of saying horses, say horses are cool, fish are cool, geckos are cool, cats are cool. So instead of just the animal, it lists the animal and then are cool. And so we're going to have to run the same code over and over. And we can do this with a for loop. A for loop cycles through something a specific number of times. And we're going to set that number of times by getting the length of this list. So we want to loop through this list the amount of times that it is large. So the amount of elements is in the list. The amount of elements in the list is the amount of times we're going to loop through it. So we're going to set this up by saying for, and then we're going to need an iterator. And an iterator is going to be the variable that keeps track of the current one we're on. So we're going to start at horses, then go to fish, and then go to geckos. So it's going to keep track of which one we're at. So we're going to start it at 0. And that's because a lot of languages, computer languages, when they're counting, they start at 0. So instead of seeing horses as number 1, fish as number 2, it instead sees horses as number 0, fish as number 1, geckos number 2, and cats as number 3. So it's a little different. Not all languages start at 0, but a lot of the more popular languages used are, but not all of them. So you'll just have to check if you're learning a new language, such as JavaScript. This one starts at 0. So let I equals 0. And we want to keep the iterator less than the length. We don't want it to exceed the size of the list. And then we're going to, that I++ means increment it to the next one. So what this loop is doing, this is called a for loop. It's starting at 0, so in this case at horses, and it's going to continue incrementing the iterator I until this condition is no longer true. So as long as the iterator is less than the length, go ahead and keep looping through the code inside of these brackets. So let's say we want to access each element, and it's not called pets, it's called, we're at animals. To access the elements, so an element is a specific entry inside the list. To access the element, we're going to use some bracket notation. So just like how we use bracket notation to create the list, we're going to use bracket notation to access elements of the list. So depending on the number we put between these brackets, it affects which one we are choosing. So remember, we start at 0. So if we're going to select horses, it would start at 0. However, we don't need to enter 0 in here because the I is actually already keeping track of that index. So index means like which one we're pointing at. It's keeping track of that. So we can actually just put I in here because it's going to start at 0, increment, go to 1, and then be at fish. And then increment and go to the next one, be at 2, at geckos. So in here we can adjust the value of the element at I inside of this list with the plus equals. So this means append. So add to the end of that current element. So we're going to say horses, or blank, whichever one we're currently at, are cool. So now if we run this, I put pets there. I meant animals. Let me retry that. Animals. Oops. Okay. It outputted this because it was the last one. But if we want to see what animals now is, if we type in the variable, we can see that now the elements inside of the list say horses are cool, fish are cool, geckos are cool, cats are cool. We just looped through all of those elements in the list and did some code to each of them. Next, we have functions. So functions are a block of one or more lines of code that perform an action or actions. And events so browser events are things that happen that can trigger some code to execute. So in the, if we look at this example, we pull over this example. So here I'm going to run this. And so we have a game, odd or even. We put a number in here, the number is odd. We can increment the number 4, it's even, odd, even, and you can change the number. It's still even. Now it's odd. And the code behind this is in HTML. We are loading our JavaScript. If we look at the JavaScript, put them side by side. We can see that we have a JavaScript function called check odd even. And check odd even is called when it detects a change from the input. So if we go back to the slides, some example of browser events that can trigger your JavaScript to execute are on click. So if something clicks, run this JavaScript. If the mouse is over the elements, so kind of like if it's hovering over, trigger this JavaScript. In this example, when it detects a change, so on change, call the function. And the thing that is changing is the input, the number that we're typing in. So check odd even, and what this function does is it has something called current number, and it's grabbing the value that's inside of that input. So if we look at the input, it has an ID called num input. It grabs that value. So now it's holding that number that's stored, or it's holding that number that was just changed inside of the input element. And it checks to see if it's even. So this operator, the mod operator, it returns the remainder of division. So if we divide 3 by 2, right? 2 goes into 3 once with 1 remainder, which is not equal to 0. So it would not be even, and it would go to the else. It's odd. If we do 4 divided by 2, well, 2 goes into 4 twice, 0 remainder, which means this is true. This condition in the conditional evaluates is true, so it is even. So yeah, in this example, we can see that it calls the JavaScript function check odd even with the onChange browser event. And I also wanted to mention JSON. JSON is it stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it is a format for storing objects, storing data. And objects are similar data that's grouped together. And it consists of key value pairs. So like if you open up a dictionary, you see a word and then you see definition. That's a key and then the value. but we'll see an example of that pretty soon. And next, we have APIs. So you can use APIs with JavaScript. APIs stand for Application Programming Interface. They are a way to exchange data between different applications. So they will deliver the requests you make for data and then respond. So it's data exchange. You can make API requests to, what we'll see soon is receive weather information. So if you look online for APIs, there's thousands of APIs that can give you data you want. So if it's available, there's lots of options out there. But maybe if you are looking for APIs that return recipes, maybe you're making a website that you input some ingredients you have, then you can use APIs to send a request to some other server that has a bunch of data for you. And maybe that special API returns recipes that work with the ingredients that you have. So there's so many options for different APIs that are out there. And you can also create your own APIs. So if you have a database with a list of books that you have, you can have an API called get books, and it can return all the books that you have in that database. And I wanted to mention jQuery. jQuery it's a JavaScript library that makes typing or using JavaScript a bit easier. So before we had document get element by ID, and remember we had hi, and we changed it, the inner HTML of the H1 element to by. Well, it would be a lot quicker to type if we use jQuery. So instead of typing document get element by ID, we just use $, and we'll use the hashtag or pound symbol ID indicator instead of typing get element by ID. So looking at some examples. So going back to the events, here's an example of the different types of events that we had. We had the on click, the on mouse hover, and then we saw on the conditionals odd even that we also had on change. But here's a quick little website. It's going to show an example of on click event. So this button, if I pull over the code, here's the code for the example that we're looking at. It says on click event. So here's that label. And then we have a button called click here for an alert. And we can see that we have the on click run this function. And we're going to be running the alert function. If we look at the alert function, we can see that it is calling alert. Yay, button was clicked. So if we check it out, yay, button was clicked, an alert. Next, we have the on mouse over and on mouse out. On mouse over is when your mouse hovers over the element that on mouse over keyword is defined. So we have on mouse over and on mouse out. That means your mouse has exited the element. So in this example, if we on mouse over this image, it's going to call zoom. And what zoom does is it's going to change the width of the image to 50%. What it is right now is inside of the CSS, the image is set to 25% by default. But in our JavaScript, when we call that zoom function, it's going to change it to 50%. So let's see what happens when we put our mouse over it. So I'm putting my mouse over. It just increased its width to 50% instead of 25%. And now when my mouse leaves, it's back down to 25% because our on mouse out calls unzoom, which then sets its width back to 25%. And see, I'll go over a sample called to do item. So here's a small little website called create a list. Here is a list generator. Refresh the page to clear the list. And right now there's no items in our list. The list is going to appear underneath the green button. If we look at the HTML, we have a H1 that says create a list, a div that is, let me zoom out on this one above. A div that's holding the text area and a button that says add item. So every time we click that button, so on click, it's going to call the add item function. So if we look at the add item function, we can get an idea of what it's doing. So it looks like it's setting a variable called content to the value of the element called item. And going back to our HTML, we can see that the text area has the ID item. So anything inside of this text area, when the button is clicked, it's going to be the value of the content variable. So the button's clicked, it calls add item, then content is set to whatever the value of whatever the value inside of the text area is. So this is the text area up here. Text area. And then it's just going to do a quick check, make sure that it's not blank. So I don't want to be able to just click this. And if it's blank, it adds nothing. So if it's blank now, it's adding nothing. But instead, I'm going to grab the element that's going to store my list items. So I have an invisible unordered list called my list. It's blank right now to start. But when I click that add item, it's going to get that my list, so it's called my list element here, and it's going to append a new element. It's going to append a new list item element, and the value of that list item element, the HTML inside of it, is that content that we set. So this is an example of JavaScript. You can interact with the website. We can say maybe create a list. Maybe we need milk. We need some carrots. So it's just making a list. And the last thing I wanted to show, the last example, was using JSON and using APIs. So I just ran this next piece of code. So this is a website that will display the current weather. So if I scroll a little bit, change the size, we can see that the latest refresh was at 7:15, and we can see the weather for tonight, Wednesday night, Thursday night. And where's all this data coming from? Well, we used an API in order to make a request and then receive the data back. So if I pull up the code, So I'm running it right now with running it right here. And look at the HTML. We have some blank content inside of the body. We have latest refresh. And then an element called span, which is just an inline element that you can set the value of. You can do that with any type of element, but I chose a span here just because it's going to remain on the same line as the paragraph. So like up here, here's the value inside of the span. And how did that happen? Well, if we look at the JavaScript, we can see that in this span called properties generated, we used jQuery to grab it and then set the text inside into some date. And you can tell because it's called new date. This is creating a date object. Remember that JavaScript is object oriented. It uses objects and other object oriented techniques. But in this case, we're creating a date and we're passing it some data. So passing it means putting some stuff between the parentheses, basically giving it something to work with. Like before, when we were calling an alert, we made a variable var, my name equals, and then quotes, Morgan. And then we had an alert, and in between the parentheses at the end of the alert function, we gave it that variable. And it knows, or we know that alert, when it receives something between the parentheses, it's going to use whatever is in between those parentheses inside of that pop-up. Or that's going to be the message inside of the pop-up. So what we've done here is we have a function that runs when the page loads. So this is all the jQuery notation. It's much shorter than what normal JavaScript would be. So normal JavaScript it's called vanilla JavaScript. There's no special libraries like jQuery that's used in it. But here we're making a request to the weather.gov website. So weather.gov actually has APIs that are available for public use. And one of them returns data about a specific location. So in here we've requested Omaha area, the forecast. But you'd have to look up the documentation for the on weather.gov to see which type of APIs to use and how to use them. But in this case, we are receiving data from this API, and we're doing something with this data. What we're doing is we are displaying them as cards. So all the data is coming back, and with JavaScript, we are making the request, doing the request, and then generating all these cards for each of the items that were returned. If we look at the console, so Control-Shift-I, we actually, in our JavaScript, we tell the console to, we put the data on the console so that we can see it. So click on the object, and we can see that this object contains, this is what was given back to us by the API. So we said, go get us the weather. And then the API said, okay, here it is. And now we have it back. And here's all the data it gave us. It gave us a list. So remember we had a list earlier with animals, the horses, geckos, fish, cats. This list has 14 items in it. And instead of the list just having strings, it has objects. So the 0th element, remember it starts at 0, has this object that contains a number, a name, a start time. So a number, a name, a start time, the temperature in Fahrenheit. And we can use all of this information inside of our website, and that's what it does. For each of the cards, it gets the temperature. So we look at that temperature for each of those items. And remember, you talked about the for loop to loop through all of the items in a list. Well, here's the for loop starting at 0 and then going to the length and then increasing it so it goes all the way through the items of the list. And then it's generating those cards. It's getting the wind speed, the temperature, so on. And to continue learning JavaScript, DoSpace actually hosts a Hello Code 2. So Hello Code 1 covers CSS and HTML. Hello Code 2 covers JavaScript. It's 8 weeks. It's a free course and application is required. Also, W3 Schools is a great resource for learning any of these parts of developing a website. So JavaScript, it has a HTML section, CSS section, and JavaScript. So if I look up JavaScript W3 Schools, pull it over. So like any of the other options at the top, it has a bunch of options on the left-hand side for specific things you can learn about JavaScript. So remember we talked about JavaScript events. Let's see what W3 Schools says about JavaScript events. Oops, I need to go back. So events are something the browser or user does, and we can make something happen. So it can like trigger code. So some events, so like on click, and then call some JavaScript. So it tells you about it and it provides examples. You can try stuff yourself. And this try it yourself little feature is really nice because you can see what they have and how it works, what it does, but you can also make changes and then run it again to see what your changes did. Codecademy has JavaScript that also has JavaScript available. YouTube, there's so many tutorials for like video tutorials for learning JavaScript. Also, if you are a member of Omaha Public Library, you have lynda.com available to you. That's another website that has some courses such as JavaScript available. And if you want to become, better at JavaScript, then you just need to practice. It takes a lot of practice to get better. Perfecting it's hard. There's so many things to learn. And just as a kind of a further learning about JavaScript, you can learn about the jQuery JavaScript library and also about JavaScript frameworks such as React, Vue, and Angular. Those are probably, I think they're the top 3. There are others, but those are the top 3 that come to mind. I know that different businesses use different projects within businesses use different frameworks. Some projects may use one, some projects may use the other, but I would recommend learning maybe at least one of them because they really simplify web development. They make it very easy to have a cohesive website and pages on a website. And with that, are there any questions? Or are questions able to be asked?
Yes, there's the option to put your questions in the chat, or you could put them in the question and answer part. So yeah.
Okay. It looks like we have another minute or so to ask any questions, but thank you very much for learning about JavaScript. Please let me know if you have any more questions. I don't think Hello Code 2 date has been set yet. I'm checking right now. Yeah, I don't think the application has gone out yet. Yeah, we will be announcing dates for the 2021 Hello Code 2, so it's to be announced. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Morgan. And thank you everyone for attending. Have a good night.